When you try to box in a nuclear power with global reach, you don't freeze history, you force it to move faster. And NATO's strategy of pressure, expansion, and isolation has pushed Russia not toward retreat, but toward recalibration, forging new alliances, hardening its economy, militarizing its borders, and shifting the battlefield from tanks and troops to energy, supply chains, cyberspace, and global influence. NATO's strategy of containment and expansion has been presented as a defensive necessity, but it is rooted in a post-Cold War assumption that security is achieved by forward pressure rather than mutual accommodation, an assumption that treated Russia not as a persistent geopolitical actor with its own red lines, but as a declining power that could be managed through gradual encirclement, military integration of neighboring states, and the steady extension of Western security architecture eastward. And this strategy relied heavily on the belief that deterrence would remain static, that Russia would absorb each new expansion as a political fact rather than a strategic threat, and that the costs of resistance would outweigh the benefits of pushback. Yet containment in this form was never neutral, because expanding alliances changed threat perceptions even when framed as defensive, altering military planning timelines, force postures, and decision-making thresholds on all sides. And as NATO grew closer to Russia's borders, the alliance increasingly blurred the line between deterrence and provocation, while insisting rhetorically that no such line existed, creating a strategic mismatch between intent and perception. And this mismatch was compounded by the institutional momentum of NATO itself, where expansion became both a political signal and an internal validation of relevance, making it difficult to pause or reconsider without appearing weak or divided. And over time, containment shifted from preventing conflict to managing escalation risk. After pressure had already been applied, turning strategy into reaction, and while NATO emphasized unity and rules-based order, the expansion model depended on unequal risk distribution, with frontline states gaining security guarantees while core members absorbed the long-term economic and military burden, creating latent tensions within the alliance. And this approach also underestimated Russia's capacity. Russia's strategic adaptation and countermeasures emerged not as a sudden pivot, but as a layered response to sustained pressure, where military doctrine, economic restructuring, diplomatic outreach, and narrative control fused into a single adaptive strategy, designed less for quick victory and more for long-term endurance. Because once Moscow concluded that NATO containment was structural rather than temporary, the objective shifted from reintegration with the Western order to survival and leverage outside it, prompting a recalibration that treated sanctions, isolation, and military pressure as constants rather than crises. And this began with a deep reassessment of vulnerability, identifying dependence on Western finance, technology, logistics, and markets as strategic weaknesses to be reduced regardless of short-term cost, leading to a deliberate pivot toward import substitution, alternative payment systems, reserve accumulation, and the redirection of trade flows towards Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, not as ideological alignment, but as risk diversification. And while these shifts initially produced inefficiencies and contraction, they also hardened the system against future shocks, transforming sanctions from a destabilizing weapon into a predictable operating condition. And militarily, Russia adapted by moving away from assumptions of rapid maneuver warfare toward a doctrine that emphasizes depth, attrition, and escalation control, integrating conventional forces with cyber operations, electronic warfare, energy leverage, and strategic messaging, creating a multi-domain posture that complicates direct confrontation by raising costs across multiple fronts simultaneously. And this approach reframed deterrence not as a binary threshold, but as a spectrum of pressure points, where responses could be calibrated below the level that would trigger unified retaliation, exploiting ambiguity and asymmetry. And alongside this, Russia expanded its defense industrial base under constraint, prioritizing volume, resilience, and redundancy over technological elegance, accepting lower efficiency in exchange for sustainability, a trade-off that aligned with a long war mindset rather than a decisive battle doctrine. And diplomatically, Moscow pursued parallel tracks, maintaining formal engagement with adversaries to manage escalation while deepening strategic partnerships with states willing to operate outside Western conditionality, offering energy, arms, and political support in exchange for market access, diplomatic cover, and logistical cooperation, thereby embedding itself into alternative networks that reduced isolation and amplified bargaining power. And these partnerships were transactional rather than ideological, flexible enough to survive shifts in global alignment. And crucially, Russia invested heavily in narrative warfare, framing the conflict not as a regional dispute, but as resistance to Western dominance, a message tailored to resonate with audiences already skeptical of US power. And while this narrative found uneven acceptance, it succeeded in preventing the formation of a truly global consensus against Moscow, limiting the reach of containment and exposing fractures in the international system. And domestically, the state tightened political control while simultaneously adjusting the social contract, prioritizing stability over growth, resilience over prosperity, and security over integration, managing public expectations through a blend of nationalism, normalization of hardship, and selective economic relief, which reduced the likelihood of internal rupture under pressure. And over time, these adaptations fed into one another, creating feedback loops that reinforced endurance. As economic resilience supported military capacity, military posture strengthened diplomatic leverage, and diplomatic space eased economic isolation, forming a strategic ecosystem designed to absorb shocks rather than avoid them. And this ecosystem does not aim to restore the pre-confrontation status quo, because that word is understood as irretrievable. Instead, it seeks to shape a new equilibrium where Russia operates as a self-sustaining pole within a fragmented global order, able to impose costs, deny objectives, and wait out opponents whose political cycles, alliance cohesion, and public tolerance for prolonged strain are finite. And in this sense, Russia's adaptation is less about outmaneuvering NATO tactically and more about contesting it temporally, betting that time, fatigue, and systemic complexity favor actors willing to accept friction as the price of autonomy, turning pressure into a proving ground rather than a breaking point. And this strategy carries risks, inefficiencies, and long-term stagnation, but it reflects a sober assessment that in a world of competing power centers, survival is achieved not by integration into a single system, but by the ability to function when systems collide. And through this lens, Russia's countermeasures are not merely reactions to NATO policy, but an attempt to redefine what strategic success looks like under permanent confrontation, shifting the measure from growth and approval to persistence and denial, where simply remaining operational, relevant, and uncontained becomes a strategic victory in itself. The shifts in global alliances and power blocs, accelerated by NATO's confrontation with Russia, reveal a deeper transformation in the international system, because what began as a regional security response quickly evolved into a sorting mechanism for the world itself, forcing states to clarify priorities, expose dependencies, and choose between alignment, hedging, or resistance. And this process did not produce a clean divide between East and West, but a far more complex mosaic of overlapping interests, where countries assessed the conflict not through ideology, but through cost, opportunity, and strategic autonomy. And as sanctions regimes expanded and diplomatic pressure intensified, many states concluded that strict alignment carried risks of its own, especially in a world already strained by energy shocks, food insecurity, debt, and post-pandemic recovery, leading them to pursue flexible positioning that allowed engagement with multiple power centers simultaneously, weakening the assumption that Western consensus could automatically translate into global consensus. And this erosion was visible in voting patterns, trade flows, and diplomatic behavior, where neutrality became not a moral stance, but a strategic asset, enabling states to extract concessions, diversify partnerships, and reduce vulnerability to coercion from any single bloc. And in this environment, Russia found space to reposition itself not as an isolated actor, but as a catalyst for multipolar coordination, leveraging shared grievances over sanctions, sovereignty, and conditionality to deepen ties with countries willing to challenge Western dominance or simply benefit from discounted energy, arms cooperation, and infrastructure deals. And while these relationships lacked the cohesion of formal alliances, their very looseness made them resilient because they were bound by transaction rather than obligation, allowing participants to cooperate without inheriting each other's conflicts. And at the same time, China's role grew more central, not as a formal ally of Russia, but as a strategic balancer, absorbing economic spillovers, mediating risk, and quietly benefiting from a distracted West, reinforcing a power configuration where influence is exercised through supply chains, finance, and standards, rather than treaties alone. And this dynamic exposed the limits of bloc-based thinking in a globalized economy, because attempts to decouple or isolate reverberated through interconnected systems, prompting countries to invest in redundancy, alternative payment mechanisms, regional trade agreements, and domestic capacity, all of which diluted the leverage of any one power center. And Europe's experience underscored this shift, as energy dependence forced rapid realignment at high cost, while other regions observed and learned. accelerating their own diversification to avoid similar vulnerability. And over time, this contributed to a world where trust, stability gave way to preparedness for disruption, making alignment less about shared values and more about risk management. And as these power blocks evolved, institutions designed for a unipolar or bipolar era struggled to adapt because consensus became harder to build and enforcement mechanisms lost effectiveness when large segments of the global economy operated outside their reach, creating governance gaps that informal networks filled, further decentralizing authority. And this fragmentation also altered the calculus of smaller states, which discovered that strategic ambiguity could be leveraged into economic and political gains as competing powers courted them with incentives rather than directives, reversing decades of hierarchical influence patterns. And yet, this newfound flexibility came with instability, because fragmented systems are less predictable, more prone to miscalculation, and harder to stabilize in crisis, increasing the risk that regional disputes could escalate without clear channels for de-escalation. And in this context, NATO's actions were interpreted differently across regions, seen by some as defense of order and by others as confirmation that power remains unevenly applied, reinforcing skepticism toward Western leadership claims. And this perception gap mattered, because legitimacy is a force multiplier in global politics, and without it even strong coalitions face diminishing returns. And as the world adjusted, economic corridors, security partnerships, and diplomatic forums multiplied outside traditional Western frameworks, signaling not a replacement of the old order, but its dilution, where multiple centers coexist, overlap, and compete. And Russia's role within this landscape is not dominant, but catalytic, contributing to a broader rebalancing where no single actor can unilaterally dictate outcomes. And this rebalancing challenges NATO's strategic assumptions, because containment strategies designed for a hierarchical system lose effectiveness when the system itself becomes networked, adaptive, and plural, and the result is a global environment defined less by clear sides and more by shifting alignments, where power is exercised through endurance, connectivity, and adaptability, and where attempts to enforce unity through pressure often accelerate the very fragmentation they seek to prevent, signaling that the strategic contest unleashed by blocking Russia extends far beyond Europe, reshaping the architecture of global power in ways that are still unfolding and increasingly difficult to reverse.